What is the best underpainting for the army painter's speed paints? Is it via slop chop or dry brush, an airbrush, or with the awesome makeup sponge? I love painting with translucent paints. May it be with oil glazes, ink washes, acrylic mediums, and now with speed paints. There are a gazillion of ways to prime or paint underpainting for speed paints. Today's video is about the best underpainting for speed paints or any contrast style paints, at least in my opinion. In this video, I will show and discuss in detail the different advantages and disadvantages of doing underpainting with an airbrush via slop chop or dry brush or with a sponge. Lastly, I will tell you why never use white and black inks for speed paint underpainting. Hi, I'm Don. Welcome to my channel. This channel is supported by all these awesome brands. Also, special thanks to The Army Painter for making this video possible. By the way, don't forget my discount codes and affiliate links down below. They won't cost you extra, but they will help my channel. Lastly, do check out spraygunner.com. They've got everything you need for painting, from top-of-the-line airbrushes to high-quality paint brands. Now that business is out of the way, let's paint. I've said this in one of my older videos before. I paint with speed paints more than the army painter paints with speed paints. I used to paint watercolor portraits since I was 12 years old. Thus, I am comfortable layering translucent paints. Airbrush or rattle cans are the fastest way to do underpainting for speed paints or any acrylic paint for miniature painting. I recommend getting a basic setup like Gallery's Turbo X Mini or Serenaire to get started with at least the priming, underpainting, and varnishing of miniatures. Me and my daughter Nico has a ton of videos on airbrushing minis and gunpla in our channels. You might want to check them out. Getting your first airbrush setup used to be the hardest part of starting to airbrush. Airbrushes and air compressors are so accessible already. Now, the only downside of airbrushing is learning how to airbrush. Once you get the hang of airbrushing, it is a very efficient tool, especially for army or batch painting. It is a bit of a hassle if you are just painting single mini though. But still, blending colors, or in this case, blending gray paints, is super fast with an airbrush. The main advantage of using an airbrush with rattle cans is that rattle can painting can get thick pretty fast. Painting with rattle cans can also get expensive fast. And of course, you get more precision with painting with an airbrush. Much like any painting method, multiple thin layers, or at least a couple of thin layers, are best when painting black primer and the initial darker gray colors. Thinner layers preserve more details and allow better drying and curing of the paints. If you like more durability and ease of airbrushing your underpainting, you may want to use solvent-type paints. Solvent-type paints are generally easier to airbrush than water-based paints. However, they are way more toxic. You have to have the space and tools to paint with solvent-type paints. Okay, I no longer paint with solvent-type paints, but if you are interested about them, my daughter Nico has a ton of videos regarding this type of paint on her channel. You might want to check those out later. Stay until the latter part of this video, as I will discuss why I chose to incorporate airbrushing, a bit of slop chop, and sponging in my speed paint underpainting method. Dry brush or slop chop. This is or was very popular for doing underpainting for speed paints or any contrast style paint. This method is very accessible. There are a million brushes available in the market, from overpriced ones to more reasonably priced Temu dry brushes. I personally use the Army Painter and Foxbite Hobbies dry brushes. Much like any painting tool, you can produce fast results with lower focus or spend more time and produce finer results. Ultimately, the main feature and advantage of using a dry brush is picking up the edges and textures of a model for quick contrast and highlights. Softer dry brushes with finer bristles produce smoother textures. Dry brushes with stiffer and rougher bristles produce rougher textures that are perfect for basing. Dry brushing can be very time-consuming if you want finer results. It may look quick and fast in YouTube videos, but you need to build up very thin layers and let each layer dry properly. If you try to speed up the drying process, you will be picking up the previous layers and ruin your finish. Dry brushing is great for a single mini or a small batch of minis. Building up gray paints over black primer is stupidly very time-consuming, especially for army painting, unless you start with a gray primer and finish up with dry brushing of white paint. Priming with gray means you will not have dark black or dark gray undersides and deep details. Less contrast in short. Dry brushing or slop chop is perfect for speed paints or any contrast style paints, since in most cases, people using this type of paint simply aim to do quick painting. However, our speed paint underpainting in today's video is aimed to produce better speed paint painting than most. If you're liking this video, do give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Now we paint with the awesome sponge. Painting with the sponge is better than with a dry brush in my opinion. The main downside with the sponge is that it won't make people like me mighty rich, since we do not have affiliate links for this cheap tool. A makeup egg-shaped blender sponge could run for as low as 20 US cents or $1 for a pack of 6 sponges here in the Philippines. They're cheap, no hobby tax so far. Using the sponge is super fun, and it covers the mini faster than with a dry brush. You should dab the sponge and never scrub it over the mini, especially over very textured surfaces. The sponge also produces a better texture than the dry brush with less effort. Also, since the egg-equal-shaped sponge is a makeup blender tool, it naturally blends easier than with the dry brush. Blending with the sponge almost feels like airbrushing, but with textures. Painting with the sponge covers faster, blends better, and fine results takes less effort than with the dry brush. But there is a caveat to the blender sponge. The blender sponge wears fast, relatively fast in comparison to the usual painting tools. The blender sponge is made for applying makeup over skin, after all, not acrylic paint over textured plastic. Another downside is the cleaning of the sponge. Well, not the same hassle as cleaning the airbrush, but still a bit more hassle than cleaning a regular paintbrush. Now, before we discuss why I designed the speed paint underpainting workflow with an airbrush, dry brush, and a sponge, I will quickly show you how to clean the sponge during and after painting. The key to utilizing the blender sponge is to keep it moist. Not wet, just moist. Before using the sponge for painting and during color changes, you have to wet and scrub the sponge a bit under running water. Gentle scrubbing of the areas with paint under running water will easily remove the paint. Once the paint is removed, squeeze the sponge to remove the excess water. I squeeze very hard since I do not want a very wet sponge before I use towels. Before painting with the blender sponge, dry the sponge with a piece of towel or a cotton shirt. Remember, you want the sponge to be moist and not wet. That's it! That is how you clean the blender sponge before, during, and after painting. The key to using the sponge is to clean it well, even during painting. A dry sponge will have crusty dried or drying paint. Cleaning will ensure a nice and fine texture during painting. Now, before my final thoughts, a huge thanks to all my patrons at Patreon. I always get the question, why you have to start with black when doing a black and white zenithal underpainting? It is not obvious in the video, but the undersides and really deep crevices of the mini remain black or dark gray since the lighter colors are painted mostly from the top. Starting with black gives your underpainting more depth. I believe that what I showed you today is the best underpainting for the Army Painter Speed Paints. We have a balance of efficiency and quality with this underpainting workflow. The airbrush is the quickest way to paint black primer and deep gray. You may want to paint a lighter gray, like uniform gray, with the airbrush for a brighter finish. Make sure to angle the airbrush to keep the undersides of the mini black or dark. A good beginner airbrush set like Gallery's Turbo X Mini should help you get started with the airbrush. I highly recommend this, since I have a Gallery affiliate link. The airbrush is the best way to produce a quick blend or gradation from black primer to dark gray or medium gray. You saw earlier in this video that once I have a good deep gray underpainting, I switch to painting a lighter gray with a dry brush. Of course, you can dry brush all the way a la slop chop. But building up gray from black primer can be very time consuming. And dry brushing lighter gray or white paint over gray primer will produce a finish with a weak contrast. Now, dry brushing white over black primer is just ugly as duck. Having a gray base using an airbrush and then dry brushing with a lighter gray or even white will highlight the raised details of any model. Dry brushing is the best way to quickly highlight details of miniatures. The dry brush is perfect for the basing or any area of the miniature that you want to have a scratchy texture. I highly recommend the dry brush set, but not as much as an airbrush set, since the affiliate commission from a dry brush set is cheaper than the commission from an airbrush set. Seriously though, get a good dry brush set. The Army Painter, Foxbite Hobbies, and the Chronicle Cards Teclon Tiger dry brushes are all very good dry brush sets. I hate that I do not have affiliate links for blender sponges, and that they are dirt cheap, but I highly recommend blender sponges for painting, especially for underpainting. Unlike the dry brush, building up grays from black primer is faster. Not easier though, since the sponge, no matter how small, is hard to use on tight crevices and areas. The sponge will also wear down faster over rough textures. Similar to the dry brush, you can use the blender sponge from dark gray to white over black primer. I have a series of videos with sponge underpainting for speed paints. You might want to check those videos out if you do not have an airbrush. The sponge is perfect for the lightest grays and white paint for underpainting. Airbrushing white paint or very light colored paints is not the easiest. Even my good friend Juan Sanz or El Miniaturista airbrushes white very roughly. Good thinning and proper air pressure are keys to airbrushing white paint. Needless to say, airbrushing white is not for everyone. Also, never use white ink as underpainting for speed paints. Inks in general do not have a strong bond on plastic. Even if you plan to varnish over inks, I do not recommend it for underpainting. Inks are great for post shading and such, but inks are weak. You always want durable underpainting before your actual painting. Dry brushing white produces a rough texture that is most visible over plain and smoother spaces like the cloak and helmets. If you want good quality underpainting, I do not recommend using the dry brush. As mentioned earlier, using the blender sponge for light grays or white is perfect. You will produce a better finish than with a dry brush, and the blender sponge is much easier than using an airbrush. As mentioned earlier, the main problem with recommending the blender sponge for full-time painters and creators like me is that they are dirt cheap and we don't have affiliate links for these awesome blender sponges. That's it, Pansit. I hope you like this video. Don't forget to subscribe, follow, and all that stuff. Until next video, guys. Bye!